Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. I'm Babak Ashrafi. Today is June 18th, 2025, and I'm speaking with Christa Kuljian. Christa is a science writer and historian of science and is a research associate at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at Wits University in Johannesburg. Christa is a Consortium Fellow from 2019-2020, and she is the author of Our Science Ourselves: How Gender, Race, and Social Movements Shape the Study of Science, which has come out recently from the University of Massachusetts Press. Thank you for talking with me, Christa.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I really enjoyed reading your book. The title of your book, Our Science Ourselves, is a play on the title of the book, Our Bodies Ourselves, which came out in 1970. And that book was important to some of the women that you write about. What did it mean to them, and how does using that title frame your book?
Yes, thank you. It definitely does. I had a copy of Our Bodies Ourselves in the 1970s when I was in high school, and it was a revolutionary book on women's health, published by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. I grew up in the Boston area, and so the title, Our Science Ourselves, is definitely a nod to our bodies ourselves, the 1970s, the Boston area, the women's movement. And the women who founded Our Bodies Ourselves were very concerned about how many doctors were presenting women's bodies and wanted to, critique that and present more information for women. And so just as those women were doing that work, the women scientists in Our Science Ourselves were looking at how to critique the way scientists, and especially biologists, were portraying women's biology. So when I studied the history of science at Harvard in the early 1980s, I studied with Ruth Hubbard, a biologist, and she had started to teach a course called Bio 109, or Biology and Women's Issues. And she edited a book called Women Look at Biology, Looking at Women. So Hubbard had reread Charles Darwin. She was shocked in the early 70s to look at how he had written about women's biology and how he portrayed female as passive and male as active. And this led to the way that many scientists looked at humans, at animals, at cells, even at molecules. So the book explores some of this early feminist critiques of science, first of biology, but then of other disciplines as well: chemistry, physics, genetics, and a growing number of women who were beginning to see science not as always neutral or objective, but as being shaped by the assumptions of the scientists themselves. And I started my research for this book by looking back first at Ruth Hubbard and the work she was doing. I miraculously still had my class notes from the mid-'80s, but I looked to see who else was she talking to, networking with. What other scientists were coming to their work with a feminist awareness at the time? And through time in the archives and interviewing other scientists, I discovered this network of women in the Boston area in the 1970s and 80s, and that include Ruth Hubbard, Rita Arditi, Evelyn Fox Keller, Evelyn Hammonds, Anne Fausto Sterling, Banu Subramaniam, and Nancy Hopkins. Now, these were not the only 7 women working on these issues, but I thought that by focusing on them could highlight some of the broader themes in the book.
Well, one of the really interesting themes that runs through the lives of the women scientists that you write about is them realizing that they weren't alone. that the issues and difficulties they were each facing as individuals were common to women in science. Can you talk about these realizations?
Yes, I think that that happened for each one of the 7 women that I write about. Their life stories illustrate these epiphanies that happened at different times for the different women, that they were not alone in their work, in their thinking. And for example, Ruth Hubbard, which I've mentioned, she worked in George Wald's biology lab at Harvard in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And it was only in 1969 that she had a bit of a turning point. In December of that year, Rita Arditi, another woman that I focus on in the book, a geneticist originally from Argentina, she led a protest at the Boston conference of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. And she and 12 colleagues, unannounced, broke into a special luncheon at the conference for women scientists. And they had posters and were speaking about discrimination against women in science. And up until that point, Ruth Hubbard, and I found this in her papers in the Schlesinger Library and in her oral histories, she spoke about the impact of that moment. Because before that, she had thought she was a scientist, she was a woman, she was at Harvard, she was publishing in scientific journals at a high level. What was the problem? But after that moment, she started to ask herself, wait a minute, why don't I have tenure yet? And she was thinking, why is she still in a junior position after 25 years of important research? So Ruth and Rita met each other. Ruth Hubbard started to invite other women scientists to her house and talk about this and realized she wasn't alone. They both started working together, writing for Science for the People, a new organization that had been formed initially in the Boston area at around that same time, 1969, 1970. Another example is Evelyn Hammonds, who in the mid-70s, she was studying physics at Spelman College in Atlanta and at Morehouse and later at Georgia Tech. And she had been told repeatedly by faculty and other students that she couldn't be a woman and a scientist, that she couldn't be a Black woman and a physicist. So she went to the library searching for readings, and she did not find much about other Black women scientists or other women scientists in general. But then one day, the librarian said, I have got something for you. And it was a report that came out in January 1976 called The Double Bind. And it was co-authored by Shirley Malcolm, another scientist, and she was on staff at the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And that report was really the first of its kind to explore the challenges facing women of color in the sciences. And Evelyn Hammonds reached out to Shirley Malcolm and this network of women. And again, she realized she's not alone. And Malcolm encouraged her to apply to MIT. And she did that and was accepted. And that's when she headed to Boston and started to interact with some of these other women scientists. And the last example I'll share is Nancy Hopkins. She too was a biologist, but in the 1970s and 80s, she was not interested in feminist analysis at all. In fact, she says she was afraid of Ruth Hubbard. She really wanted to focus on her science in the lab. She felt she couldn't address issues of discrimination and bias and conduct her science at the same time. So it was really the circumstances she faced in the 1990s at MIT that forced her to look to others and join with others. Because in the mid-90s, Nancy Hopkins was down on her hands and knees with a measuring tape, measuring space in her lab to confirm her suspicion that women had less lab space than men in the biology department. And it was only then for her that she turned to other women scientists at MIT. And she learned that she was not alone. And in fact, they were facing similar issues. So when they came together as a group, they had a lot more influence. And they published the now quite famous MIT report on women in science in 1999. So that was really a different era, different generation. But people come to these realizations at different times in life.
You've mentioned MIT, Harvard, Cambridge. What happened in and around that area to make it a center for feminist science studies?
Well, it was not the only center by any means, but it was a place that interested me for several reasons. One, the history of Boston was such that it was a factor in my choice, because already Boston in the 1600s had become a center of education. Harvard was established in 1636. MIT was founded in 1861. And there are hundreds of colleges and universities in the greater Boston area. It is an academic hub. And none of the 7 women that I focus on and share their life stories were actually born in Boston. Ruth Hubbard, her family fled Vienna, Austria in the 1930s. Rita Ardides from Argentina, and Fausto Sterling, Evelyn Fox Keller, Nancy Hopkins were from New York City. Banu Subramaniam is from India. So they all came to Boston to study, to take a job, to research, or to network with other scientists. And also in the 1970s, I could see that the Boston area became a hub for a number of different social movements that had an impact on this group of women and others. Our Bodies, Ourselves, which we spoke about, Science for the People was another major organization that was concerned about the militarization of science, looking at wanting for science to have the benefit for working class people and not only the elite. Another group formed, the Sociobiology Study Group in the mid-70s, that was protesting and speaking out against sociobiology and biological determinism, which was presented as biology being destiny. And there was a lot of concern about the racism and sexism in that view. Another organization, the Combahee River Collective, was formed in the 1970s in Boston. And it was an organization that was making space for Black women in the women's movement, Black feminist, lesbian women. And that made space for Black women such as Evelyn Hammonds. But it also had an influence on some of the white women scientists in the book in terms of making the case that it's important not only to look at the way that science presents stereotypes of white women as passive and needing to be in the home, but that there was a whole nother set of stereotypes presented about working class women and African American women and enslaved women. So I really wanted to have a narrative that would run through the book, not only about these social movements, but about, the women's lives. And I know that it wasn't only in this place that women were critiquing their science, but I felt that by looking at this place at that time, that we could illustrate some of the broader themes and issues about the early beginnings of feminist science studies.
These scholars that launched or participated in feminist science studies addressed a set of issues, as you describe in your book. They addressed sexism in science. They addressed the science of gender difference. They addressed the gendered nature of scientific knowledge and practice. And all along the way, they addressed or advocated for addressing the intersections of race and gender in science. Is it possible, looking back now, to make an assessment of what the field of feminist science studies has achieved?
I think it is possible but difficult to do, because I think that the field of science studies as a whole, which was developing in the 1990s, was enormously affected and shaped by, many of feminist scientists and philosophers of science. And in the 90s, there was a very interesting conversation that I write about in the book between Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour. It was in 1994. And Bruno Latour was quite famous at the time in the fledgling field of science studies. And Donna Haraway pointed out to him in person that he was drawing on issues, concepts that had been written about decades earlier by many of the women in the book, and that he was not citing them. So there was not a practice of citation of feminist science studies. And so she called him out on that. And I think it's one example of how so much has occurred in this field that isn't necessarily recognized as being sourced from those authors and those writers. And Evelyn Hammonds and Banu Subramaniam had a conversation in 2003, looking back on the 70s and 80s and 90s and saying, what has been accomplished? What has occurred in this field? What is happening with feminist science studies? And one of the things that they remarked on was that there was no annual conference. There was no single journal for the field, although that has changed with the journal Catalyst, which is about to celebrate its 10th anniversary. But they pointed to the fact that the field was very diffuse. It was affecting so many disciplines, and that they had to keep up with the field by reading in biology, in science studies, in women's studies, in gender and sexuality studies, in so many different fields, philosophy of science. So I like the metaphor that feminist science studies has been like dendrites, spreading impulses far beyond their source, and that they continue to inspire new research and analysis in a very broad way. So this field has made contributions around, as you said in your question, around gender, race, and sexuality studies, and how those fields have contributed to science, medicine, and technology. The field has contributed new methodologies of how to account for bias. It's asking new questions. Who is doing science? Who decides research questions? Who offers analysis? And who benefits from the science? And these are all questions that continue to be relevant today.
Toward the end of your book, you recount Larry Summers, who was the president of Harvard in 2005, attributing the underrepresentation of women in science to biological or genetic difference. And he did this at an event. He was speaking in front of some of the women that you write about in your book. You finished your book and it's out now, but if you had finished your book in 2025, you might have addressed contemporary attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in higher education. What can we learn about our current situation and how we might act now from the history of feminist science studies?
Yes, you are pointing to something that I have thought about since the book came out at the end of 2024. The book ends in the early 2000s, but I do write an epilogue that takes us up to about 2023. And yes, I would have written that epilogue differently if I had been writing it in 2025. I think that there is a theme that runs repeatedly through the book of how when there is progress with the women's movement or the civil rights movement, that there is a resulting call for more research related to sex differences and racial differences. And so when sociobiology came out in the mid-1970s, there was concern about the issues it was presenting, that it was saying that the fact that there are fewer women in leadership, fewer women in the sciences, is accounted for by biological differences. So when Larry Summers, drawing, I might add, on Steven Pinker's writing, said that he was explaining the absence of more women in the sciences to biological differences, Ruth Hubbard at the time, in 2005, called it warmed over sociobiology. She felt that women scientists were needing to write about and push back against some of the same kinds of faulty arguments that she had been seeing since the 70s. And that is what she was saying in 2005. Well, here we are in 2025. And again, these issues very much are with us. When we look at the movements that have taken place in the last several years, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, there has been a backlash. And I did a series of book talks about Our Science Ourselves on the East Coast of the US in March this year at a series of libraries and bookstores and colleges and universities. And everyone was interested in the history from the book, but also we turned almost immediately to the present and the US administration's attack on science, on diversity, on anything having to do with gender and race. And so many faculty and students were talking about funding cuts for their work, their research, their scientific lab work, and the scrubbing of words from websites and documents. So we ended up talking about how the women in Our Science Ourselves were facing certain challenges in their era that perhaps we can learn from today in terms of how many scientific institutions historically have been exclusionary, that women don't want to stay isolated as individuals, women and people of color joining with others in collectives to support their important work, to support their important scientific questions and research projects. So I do think that the history of gender, race, and sexuality studies and how it's made vital contributions to science and medicine and technology and the history of these women's lives and how dynamic they were can offer us inspiration for the present.
Thank you, Christa, for sharing your work with us.
Oh, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the Consortium for all your important work.
The book is Our Science Ourselves, published by the University of Massachusetts Press. Listeners can find more resources for exploring this topic, as well as others, at www.chstm.org. This has been a podcast from the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine.